Clint Eastwood disintegrated during his concluding dialogue with Johnny Carson. Not bodily, sentimentally. And for 45 seconds, 15 million observers watched in absolute stillness as Hollywood's grittiest man collapsed on national television. Unable to talk, unable to exhale, conquered by a reality he'd been concealing for 23 years. The date was May 22, 1991. Clint was 61 years old. He'd spent 3 decades portraying gunslingers who never recoiled, investigators who never exhibited terror, and champions who never sobbed. But on that Wednesday evening in Burbank, California, America witnessed the man with no name finally unmask the mystery that had haunted him since 1968. What sparked the disintegration? It wasn't a coronary event. It wasn't fatigue. It was something far more agonizing. A disclosure about his son. A son the planet didn't realize existed. A son Clint had kept obscured from Hollywood, from the journalists, from everyone because he was embarrassed. Not of his boy, never of his boy, but of himself. When Clint finally articulated again after those 45 seconds of stillness, his tone fractured with decades of remorse. "I failed him, Johnny," he breathed. "I failed my son because I was too terrified to be fragile." And then arrived the instant that altered everything. Johnny Carson stood up, stepped around his bureau, and performed something he'd never done in 30 years of anchoring. He sat beside Clint, and uttered 5 words that shattered the internet before the internet even existed. "Let's bring him out here." The spectators gasped because backstage, lingering in the wings, was Scott Eastwood, 23 years old, and about to step onto the Tonight Show platform to confront the father who'd obscured him from the planet. If you want to realize why Clint Eastwood kept his son a mystery for over 2 decades, and what occurred when they finally confronted each other on live television, keep watching. Tap that like icon and leave a remark telling me where you're watching this from. Let's plunge into one of the most poignant instants in television annals. But first, we need to return to where this narrative truly commences. May 22, 1991, the Tonight Show facility in Burbank was arranging for what would become the most unforgettable installment in its 30-year annals, though nobody realized it yet. Johnny Carson was in his concluding season, just months away from departure, and he'd specifically petitioned this dialogue with Clint Eastwood. But this wasn't a standard publicity appearance. Clint wasn't there to discuss a new film. He'd phoned Johnny personally 3 weeks prior and remarked something that made the legendary anchor pause. "I need to visit your broadcast, Johnny. There's something I need to utter out loud before it's too late." Johnny had interviewed Clint 7 times over the years. Each appearance was notable for what Clint didn't articulate as much as what he did. The man was legendary for his stillness, his one-word replies, his capacity to convey everything with just a gaze. But Johnny always honored that. He never insisted. He built a secure zone where Clint could be himself, even if that self was hushed and guarded. But when Clint made that phone call, he detected something distinct in his tone. Crisis, agony, something uncompleted. Johnny's staff briefed him that this dialogue might be momentous. But even they didn't realize what Clint was intending to unmask. All they realized was that Clint had petitioned something strange. He desired someone lingering backstage during the dialogue. He wouldn't articulate who, just that when the instant was correct, Johnny would realize. On the day of filming, staff members noticed Clint arrived 3 hours early, which was unlike him. He was pacing in his dressing booth, not practicing, not arranging quips, just pacing. A cosmetic artist later remarked she'd never observed him so anxious. His palms were quivering, she remembered. Clint Eastwood's palms were actually quivering. When Johnny did his pre-show habit of visiting guests in their dressing booths, he found Clint gazing at a photograph. Johnny couldn't see what it was, but he saw Clint quickly slide it in his coat pocket. "You all right, Clint?" Johnny asked. Clint peered at him with eyes that bore 23 years of burden and simply remarked, "I will be after tonight. I will be." The studio spectators had no idea what was approaching. They'd waited in line for 6 hours, some clutching boards that read, "Clint, we love you," and "Dirty Harry" indefinitely. They anticipated the standard Clint Eastwood dialogue, cynical wit, frontier narratives, maybe a few behind-the-scenes stories from his latest project. They had no idea they were about to witness the instant Clint Eastwood halted being a myth and became a father. When Clint Eastwood stepped onto the Tonight Show platform that May night, he appeared exactly how America anticipated, tall, serene, wearing a dark blue coat and denim, advancing with that unhurried poise audiences had watched for 30 years. The studio spectators erupted in massive cheering. Clint gave his iconic half grin and raised one palm in a humble wave. But Johnny Carson saw something distinct. As Clint approached the podium and they shook palms, Johnny noticed Clint's hold was firmer than usual. His jaw was gritted, and his eyes kept jumping toward the side of the platform like he was verifying to make sure someone was there. "Clint Eastwood, ladies and gentlemen," Johnny proclaimed, pointing to the visitor's seat. Clint sat down, crossed his legs, and for the first few minutes, everything appeared standard. Johnny asked about Unforgiven, the Western Clint was guiding and starring in. Clint gave his standard brief replies. "It's a fine draft. We commence filming in July. It's grittier than most Westerns." The spectators laughed at his brevity. This was classic Clint Eastwood, the hearty, hush type America loved. Johnny asked about collaborating with Gene Hackman and Morgan Freeman. Clint shared a story about Morgan tumbling off a stallion during practice and getting back on without grumbling. "That's expertise," Clint remarked. The spectators cheered. Johnny asked if Clint ever got weary of portraying hardy guys. "Somebody's got to perform it," Clint quipped. More giggling. For 20 minutes, the dialogue flowed exactly like their former conversations. Clint was relaxed enough to offer quips, pensive when discussing his work and characteristically humble about his triumphs, but those who realized him well noticed something beneath the exterior. His palms weren't relaxed. He kept tweaking his clock, and every few minutes he gazed toward the wings of the platform. Johnny, exhibiting the instinct that made him television's finest dialogue artist, detected the burden Clint was carrying. He asked queries but didn't insist. When Clint paused longer than usual, he permitted stillness to exhale. He was giving Clint's zone to reach wherever he required to go. Then about 25 minutes into the dialogue, Johnny asked a seemingly harmless query. "Clint, you've portrayed so many iconic figures. The man with no name, Dirty Harry, these men who stand solitary and confront everything heathen. Is there any part of that which is truly you, or is it all theater?" Clint's countenance altered. The spectators could see it. He peered down at his palms. The facility grew hushed. People detected something transitioning. And then Clint Eastwood performed something he'd never done in 3 decades of public appearances. He peered directly at Johnny Carson and remarked, "Can I tell you something I've never told anyone publicly? It's about my son." The spectators gasped because nobody realized Clint Eastwood had a son. Johnny Carson's professional poise remained firm, but his eyes expanded slightly. "Of course, Clint. Whatever you required to articulate." Clint took a deep breath. "In 1968, I had a son. His name is Scott. He's 23 years old now, and most of the planet doesn't realize he exists." The studio spectators gasped sharply. Even Johnny appeared genuinely startled. "Why didn't anyone realize?" Johnny asked softly. "Because I was shielding him," Clint remarked, his tone steady but strained. "His mother and I weren't wedded. The condition was complex. I thought if I kept him out of the limelight he could have a standard life. That's what I told myself for 23 years. Clint paused, clutching the armrest. "But that's not the whole reality, Johnny. And I visited here tonight to tell the whole reality." The stillness in the facility was absolute. 15 million observers across America tilted nearer to their screens. "When Scott was born," Clint persisted, his tone fracturing. "The medics told me he had cerebral palsy. They remarked he might never walk without aid, might never survive independently, might battle his whole life." His eyes shone. "And I was terrified." Johnny tilted forward. "Terrified of what?" "Of being fragile." Clint's tone shattered. "I'd built my career portraying men who were never terrified, never vulnerable, never required aid, gunslingers who confronted outlaws, officers who never retreated. And then I had a son who required me to be hardy in a completely distinct way. He required me to be vulnerable, to petition for aid, to admit I didn't have all the answers." Tears flowed down Clint's face. The spectators sat in paralyzed stillness. This was the man with no name sobbing on national television. "And Johnny, I failed him. I kept him obscured because I was embarrassed. Not of Scott. Never of Scott. I was embarrassed of myself. Embarrassed that I wasn't the hardy guy everyone thought I was." And then it occurred. Clint Eastwood disintegrated. Not bodily but sentimentally. His head fell into his palms. His shoulders trembled for 45 seconds. He couldn't talk. Couldn't gaze up. Could barely exhale. Nobody in the spectators moved. Nobody coughed. Nobody murmured. They just witnessed Hollywood's icon of vigor fall apart. Johnny gave him zone, permitting him to release 23 years of remorse. The lensman kept filming. Realizing people required to see this, not because it was shocking but because it was human. After 45 seconds, Clint raised his head. His countenance was wet with tears. "But last week, Johnny Scott finished from UCLA with a film degree. The medics were incorrect." "He validated everyone incorrect?" and I realized I've squandered 23 years obscuring the best thing that ever occurred to me. Clint peered at the lens. I brought him here tonight. He's backstage and I need to tell him I'm sorry in front of the planet. I need to tell everyone that my son Scott is the bravest, sturdiest person I've ever recognized and that I was a coward for obscuring him. The spectators was weeping openly. Johnny had tears flowing down his countenance. Then Johnny performed something that would make television annals. He peered toward the wings and remarked, "Scott Eastwood, if you're back there, would you step out here? I think there's someone who desires to talk to you." For 3 seconds nothing occurred. The entire facility held its breath. And then, from the side of the platform, a young man emerged. Scott Eastwood was 23 years old, tall like his father, with the same sturdy jawline and sharp eyes. He walked steadily onto the Tonight Show platform, and the spectators immediately rose to their feet. The cheering wasn't artificial. It was dignified, respectful. These people understood they were witnessing something hallowed. Clint stood up as his son approached. For a moment they just peered at each other, father and son. 23 years of interval between them, and then Clint Eastwood opened his limbs and hugged his son. "I'm so sorry," Clint remarked clearly, his tone fracturing. "I'm so sorry, Scott." Scott held his father firmly. "Dad, it's all right." The hug endured nearly 30 seconds, but nobody cut away. The lensman kept the shot wide, filming an embrace that was 23 years late. Johnny Carson stood to the side, dabbing his eyes, giving them their instant. Finally they detached. Johnny offered Scott the other visitor's seat. "Scott, did you realize your dad was going to perform this tonight?" Scott sat looking at his father with love and worry. "No, sir. He just phoned last week and remarked, 'Visit the Tonight Show. I have something to tell you.'" This was certainly a shock. The spectators laughed, tension fracturing slightly. Johnny smiled. "That's some shock. How are you feeling?" Scott took a breath. "Mr. Carson, can I be truthful? My dad just told 15 million people that he was embarrassed and that he failed me. But that's not true. Not even close." Clint appeared startled. Scott turned to confront his father. "Dad, you think you obscured me from the planet? But you didn't obscure from me. You were at every medic's visit, every physical cure session, every tiny triumph. When I took 3 steps without my support," Scott's tone grew firmer. "You instructed me to ride stallions even when medics remarked I couldn't. You put a lens in my palms when I was 12 and instructed me how to compose a shot. You believed in me when everyone else was giving me pity." He peered at Johnny. "My dad thinks he kept me mystery because he was embarrassed, but the reality is I petitioned him to. I urged him not to tell Hollywood about me because I didn't desire to be Clint Eastwood's impaired son. I desired to be Scott. Just Scott. And Dad gave me that gift." Clint's countenance showed total shock. "You petitioned me not to tell people." "Yes, Dad. When I was 16 I told you I desired to make it on my own. That if people realized I was your son, they'd either pity me or give me chances I didn't merit." Scott took his father's palm. "You weren't shielding yourself, Dad. You were shielding me like you always did." Johnny appeared genuinely moved. "Clint, it sounds like the narrative you've been telling yourself for 23 years isn't the narrative your son experienced." Clint couldn't talk. He just held his son's palm and gestured. Scott turned to confront the spectators and the lens. "Can I say something to everyone observing?" Johnny gestured. "Please. I've watched my dad portray champions my whole life," Scott commenced. "Sturdy, hushed gunslingers, hardy investigators, men who never sobbed, never exhibited terror, never petitioned for aid. And I love those figures. Everyone does. But they're not real." He peered at his father. "Tonight, my dad exhibited you something real. He exhibited you what actual bravery appears like. It's not about never being terrified. It's about being panicked and performing the correct thing regardless. It's about admitting you were incorrect. It's about saying I'm sorry when you require to, even if 15 million people are observing." The spectators commenced cheering, but Scott raised his palm. "I'm not finished." The cheering halted. "Dad, you didn't fail me. You gave me the grandest gift a father can give his son. You showed up every single day. You showed up. And tonight, you showed up for me in front of the whole nation. That's not frailty. That's the sturdiest thing I've ever seen anyone perform." Clint was weeping again, but this time he was smiling through the tears. Johnny stood up and commenced cheering. The entire studio spectators followed, and the cheering built and built until it was massive. But this wasn't cheering for Dirty Harry or the man with no name. This was cheering for a father who'd finally pardoned himself. Johnny performed something unheard of then. He stepped between father and son and put his limbs around both of them. A 3-way hug on national television. 3 men, all weeping, all human, all linked by an instant of pure honesty. As the cheering endured for nearly 2 minutes, Johnny tilted in and murmured something to Clint that the microphones barely captured, but lip experts later validated what he remarked. "You just altered a lot of lives tonight, Clint, including your own." The reaction to Clint Eastwood's dialogue was unheard of. NBC's switchboard obtained over 50,000 calls within 1 hour. Letters arrived by the thousands. Parents sharing their own narratives of embarrassment and terror about their children. The National Alliance on Mental Illness termed it the most vital instant in television annals for lessening shame around impairments. Johnny Carson later remarked it was the dialogue that counted the most to him in 30 years of anchoring. Clint didn't just expose his soul, Johnny mused months later during his departure special. He gave consent to millions of fathers to perform the same. He exhibited America that vulnerability isn't the inverse of vigor. It's the purest form of it. Scott Eastwood went on to become a prosperous director and impairment rights worker. He and his father worked on 3 movies together, each one investigating themes of atonement, fatherhood, and second opportunities. In interviews, Scott always says the same thing. "My bond with my dad didn't start that evening on The Tonight Show. But that's when the planet got to see what I'd recognized my whole life. That he's not just a hearty guy, he's a fine man." Today, film academies show clips from that dialogue alongside Clint's finest movie acts. Parent help groups mention the Clint Eastwood instant when discussing accepting children's variances. And impairment workers point to that evening as a cultural shifting point when America commenced to grasp that vigor has nothing to do with obscuring your battles and everything to do with confronting them truthfully. Clint Eastwood spent 30 years portraying men who never broke down. But when he finally did, he instructed the planet that breaking down isn't the end of vigor. Sometimes it's the start. If this narrative moved you, tap that join icon for more true narratives about the instance when myths exhibited us their humanity. Share this clip with someone who requires to hear that being vulnerable is the bravest thing you can perform. And leave a remark telling me where you're watching this from. Recall, your children don't require you to be flawless. They require you to be present. Don't obscure your truth.